Welcome. Philosophical neurosis. It's a term that I coined some time ago. What is it? And more particularly, how do you know if you have it? And how do you know if your friend has it? Well, let's examine this question. First of all, what is it? It's belief that is not based on evidence. In a sense, it's belief that floats free from how the world is. Now, the idea that is a problem in belief, that it's a malformed belief, comes from the 19th century mathematician, philosopher named William Kingdon Clifford. And Clifford said, in summary, he said, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. If one does so, what one has is the beginning of a philosophical neurosis, because false beliefs, false things that one is believing, grow in the mind. They weaken the mind by making it credulous, by making it easier to believe other non-true things or things that have no evidential support. And they bring in their train other beliefs with them. They accumulate falsehoods around them. And eventually one is, as it were, one is afloat with these rootless beliefs on a sea of self-deception. And that is philosophical neurosis. How did this come about? Where did this come from? Well, as I've told you in the past, Clifford gave this view in the middle to late 19th century, around 1877. The idea was really put in place to try to prevent something which at that point really hadn't come into any kind of full flowering. Oddly enough, it was after Clifford had made this statement, made this claim, that it really somehow came into being, that what he had warned against came after he had given the warning. And it came about in the 20th century. In fact, if there's anyone going to look back on the 20th century, if there will be anyone to look back on the 20th century, what they're going to see are human beings that are barely recognizable as rational beings who are awash in a sea of self-deception and false beliefs, beliefs that they can't justify to themselves. And that's the situation which I'm trying to contend with and trying to, as it were, push back against, because I'm not seeing very many people doing that. But I think it's something that one has to do. So where did it come about in the 20th century? Well, it seems to have first arisen in Leninism. Leninism was, as a doctrine, the sort of early Marxism of Russia in the 1918, 1919, etc., and into the 1920s. Leninism was a view which tried to which defended itself as a way of being, as a belief system, not by offering arguments for why it was going to work, because at the time there was no evidence that it was going to work at all. There was no reason for it, but to believe that it should work. So instead of defending it in a sort of rational way, it was the way that was adopted was to accuse anyone who opposed the system of being somehow in the grip of something, or what. This was a term that was used at the time, they were accused of being a capitalist lickspittle, a boot-licking capitalist, a bourgeois traitor, a something or other. And this accusation was meant to do all that was needed in order to head off any criticism of the Leninist system. Anyone who might suspect that there was something not quite right in the Leninist view was simply accused. So that was really, it seems, the first solid example of this. It was a political view that one could not criticize, because any criticism showed that the person criticizing had a bad view, where they were in the grip of something bad. That badness meant that their criticisms were automatically diffused. That was it seems, the original idea for this. And one can see that, in some sense, the Leninists were forced into this view by the fact that they couldn't cite any evidence of why their system of beliefs was going to work. Now, of course, everyone now has a familiarity with this view, which they may not have with the original Leninism, but they do have it indirectly, because this was exactly the view that George Orwell was exposing, this self-defending view, which defends itself by accusing others. It was this that Orwell was noting in 1984. He had taken that early Leninist view, which became a Stalinist view, and was, of course, utterly vicious for all of its enemies, because what it did to its enemies was not just accuse them, it also killed them. It sent them to gulags. It sent them to prison camps in Siberia where they were bound to die. If you wish to see a film which shows what those gulags were like, watch the film One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It's on YouTube, at least it was the last time I checked. Watch it and you can see what it was like. So you weren't just defending by accusing your critics. You were also silencing them by sending them to a gulag. And this is what Orwell understood very well and had seized upon to write about in 1984. Remember, the act of criticizing the party in 1984 is called wrong-think. You're guilty of wrong-think. What happens if you commit wrong-think? Well, you will be sent to the room to be tortured, mentally, physically, whatever it takes, in order for you to submit. That is the goal. The goal is for you to submit, to stop criticizing, just submit. Now, that idea of Orwell's, You may not know this, but in fact Orwell not only did he not invent the idea, it came directly from Leninist Stalinism, but he didn't invent even the concept of the novel. It was in fact a thinly rewritten version, one can debate on how much it was rewritten, of this book by Yevgeny Zamyatin called We. Now, Zamyatin's book was written in the 1920s at the height of the Leninism, and it exposed the same problems that Orwell showed later. I think Orwell went into it in far more detail, but Zamyatin's book is still a very worthwhile read if you want to understand where Orwell's book as a literary work came from. It comes directly really from Zamyatin's We. And in this book you also get all of the absolute confusion in a mind that has this doctrine indoctrinated in it. All of that is really well spelled out in Zamyatin's book, so I strongly recommend it. That idea is really that at the end, you can't think even of the criticisms of the party or the ruling class or whatever it is. You can't think of those things. Your brain has already been shaped, formed by a series of behavioral modifications. You are already programmed in that sense to not be able to criticize, for that not to even be thinkable. That was really the first example. Then the idea of this kind of self-protective view caught on. And the argument has been that it caught on, first of all, in Freudian psychoanalysis of the 1920s, just slightly after this. Leninism was flowering. In psychoanalysis, the idea was anyone who was a patient who tried to criticize the psychoanalytic view would find that their criticism was null and void, because it came from someone, it must come from someone who is suppressing, repressing the very impulses that the psychoanalyst is trying to bring out and dissolve. So you are in the grip of the very maladies which the psychoanalyst is trying to expose for you, for your own health and benefit. You're going against your own health by criticizing the psychoanalytic process. There is no way out of that. Now, this is not to say that Freud was, or that Freudianism is necessarily guilty of this. It's not intrinsic in psychoanalysis, but there were many psychoanalysts of the Freudian school who were able to use this technique to disarm any criticism that their view was wrong, pointless, that it was not getting to the heart of any psychoanalytic problems, that it was capable of diffusing criticisms of it by giving this idea that any criticisms were coming from a place that were mired deep in the very psychoanalytic problems that the psychoanalyst was trying to expose. So that became the second example of this. And it's an arguable point how much Freud himself was responsible for this. One thing is clear, is that other breakaway psychoanalysts like Jung did not resort to this idea at all, it seems. It was more of a Freudian methodology. So that's the second example. The third example, in a sense, borrows from both of those. It might surprise you, but it was actually C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis's form of Christianity was perhaps taken a little bit from history of Christianity, but it was also borrowing from these 20th century sources. On the idea of this Lewisian Christianity, if you were to attempt to criticize Christianity, if you were to attempt to say that, well, what is the evidential basis of this? Just as you might have said, what's the evidential basis of this Freudian analysis? What's the evidential basis for this Christianity? Then the Lewisian response would be, the very fact that you ask this question shows that you are in the grip of the devil or Lucifer or Satanism or something of that kind. You are not asking these questions free. You are somehow a tool of the devil. That's the sort of idea. Now, this is a familiar idea now, very familiar. And, it's frequently put down to people who are, let's put it into a modern term, deplorables. And yet we hear this kind of thing very often now, and by the very people who have used that phrase, deplorables, when we hear it said, for example, that anyone who criticizes modern wars of the current form must be a tool in the grip of, or the use of, by Putin. Putin is using them for his own propaganda purposes. What's the difference between that and saying that anyone who criticizes Christianity is a tool of Satan? It's the same thing, the very same thing. So when you ask for justifications, when you ask for reasons and evidence to support the view that you are criticizing, what you are given is this accusation. You are not given what you asked for, evidence, to justify the position that the person has taken. You are given, you are accused. You are accused. You are a tool of Putin. You are a tool of Satan. You are a tool of the capitalist laxspittles. You are a tool of the very psychoanalytic condition that the psychoanalyst is trying so hard to rid you of. You are a tool. That is the accusation. You are not, in asking these perfectly reasonable questions, you are not someone asking for clarification. No. You are a tool. And you must be treated. You must be treated not to be a tool. You must be shown the way. You must be shown the light. Which is not to give you evidence. It's to show you that your question was never a well-formed question in the first place. Your doubts were never well-formed. That's the idea. Now, I hope now that's all familiar enough, because it should be, because we live in a swamp of this. And we encounter it all the time. Of course, it's the logic of a cult. Forget Lewisian Christianity, but if someone is in a cult, that this is exactly how they are treated. You can't criticize the cult. You're meant to imbibe the views of the cult. You're meant to get to the point where you will agree to them automatically, freely. You are meant to understand that the cult, which is meant to be your protector and benefactor, can't possibly be wrong in these things. And so if you were to doubt the cult, well, you're obviously just lost. You're obviously just not getting it anymore. You're somehow in the grip of something. What is it? What are you in the grip of? Must be a bad thing, an anti-cult thing. You're seeing something in a way that the cult doesn't want you to see. Well, that's not good. We'll have to take you aside and we'll have to make you see it. This is the world. Now, one person who really pointed this out in the 20th century, to his credit, Russell was one, but the one who did more even than Russell for this, on this specific strategy, this self-defensive strategy that was adopted for these particular ways of thinking, was Sir Karl Popper in his book Conjectures and Refutations. And what you find is that Popper gets the essence of this internal view. These views are not on their own terms falsifiable or criticizable. They have put themselves beyond criticism and beyond falsification. So they brook no dissent. Obeying is the only thing they know and understand. If you don't do that, then they will find some way to punish you. That's the idea. And the first act of punishment, the first justification for that punishment, will be their accusation. You're a this or you're a that. So if someone won't defend what they think, what they say that they believe, by citing evidence for you, by giving you the evidence, and if they instead accuse you of something, whatever it is, then you know that that person is in the grip of philosophical neurosis. And they want you to be in the grip of that too. Because one of the things about falsehoods, and this is something that Clifford, I must say, didn't point out, but one of the things about this kind of entrenching falsehood in oneself is that one has to then entrench it in others, because others believing what you believe becomes your evidence for why you should believe it. That's how these beliefs work. They work by spreading themselves. If someone believes a cult view, if they come to have a cult view, then they want to proselytize this to other people so that they have that same cult view, because them having the cult view becomes your evidence for why you were right in the first place, that you convinced them. That's how it works. So it spreads, and it has to spread. The person who has this, who's in the grip of this philosophical neurosis, has to make other people around them neurotic as well. And they cannot rest until everyone is neurotic in the same way with the same beliefs. So if there's someone who won't be convinced, they have to be excluded. They have to be shunned. They cannot be a friend anymore. Because one thing that this view cannot brook is dissent. It cannot see someone who is not convinced. Because if there is someone who is not convinced, then the person must end up doubting that they are convinced. What is it that convinced them? If there is someone, a number of people, who they know that is not convinced of this, who are not true believers, then the house of cards that they live in is going to collapse around them. And that's exactly what happens. That's why cults spread. That's why all of these views are absolutely condemnatory of dissent. Dissent cannot be allowed. Dissent has to be excluded at any costs. The true believers, those who are inside this bubble of false belief, cannot be exposed to those who are on the outside. They cannot be exposed even to someone asking, well, what's your evidence for this? They cannot endure that. Their own beliefs will begin to crumble. So, Karl Popper really did expose this, and perhaps didn't in some ways go far enough, or his view wasn't sufficiently enough taken up. And his own view was based on this idea of falsification. So what he thought was, well, if a view can't be falsified, he didn't put it in the terms that Clifford had put it in terms of one has to have evidence for one's beliefs. He put it in terms of, if one's belief is not falsifiable, then one does not have a rational belief. Well, if it's falsifiable by evidence. So you may say it comes to the same thing. I don't think it's exactly the same, but nevertheless, in practical terms, it may well come to about the same thing. Okay. Now, what should one make of this? What is it? Well, the reason I call it philosophical neurosis is because, in some sense, these beliefs that are got by this kind of process, this kind of indoctrination, which is then followed by a process which forbids you from questioning it, which actively fences you off from any possible criticism and even any request from providing evidence, that, I say, is not actually a belief. What you have is not actually belief. What those cult members have is not belief. What those poor citizens around Lenin had when they dutifully espoused the correctness of the revolution, saluted it, what they had was not belief. They had not been provided with any evidence, and what they had, therefore, was not belief. I want to tell you a short story, which is absolutely true, I must tell you. It's a striking example of what I'm talking about now. One of my ex-students was a mature age student. He was a married man, and he had gone back to university to do philosophy, having done something else initially. And he had married into a particular kind of cult. His prospective wife was a member of the cult, her family was, and he became a member of this cult and was there for all the period of time in which his children were growing up. He was a dutiful member. He was a leading member. If you had asked him at any point, look, do you believe, let's say the group believes X, do you believe X? He would have said, yes, I believe it. No. Do you fervently believe X? Yes. Yes, I fervently believe X. Do you know X? Yes. I know X. I know it with every fiber of my being. All of me is embracing X. He would have said that. If you'd ever asked him, he would have said that without any doubt, he believed X. At some point, I think there was a crisis in the marriage. At some point, he was out of the marriage, and at least temporarily. And he suddenly realized that he didn't believe X. But worse, he suddenly realized that he had never believed it. He had never believed it. Now that is striking, but it's not uncommon. This is how it works. Once the, as it were, the bubble is burst, There's nothing to keep you in it anymore. And suddenly you realize there was no evidence. And if there was no evidence for it, what was keeping you in it? Why, whatever made you say that you believed it? And now it makes no sense to say that you ever believed it. So the whole thing was an illusion. It was a delusion. Now, there'll be others who have a different experience. Some people come out of a cult and they say, well, I did believe all of that, but now I don't believe it. No, that's also something that one could say. But the reason for this confusion about this point is that, and this is something that is a big philosophical issue, in some sense, if one automatically has beliefs as a result of evidence, and in some sense there's nothing controversial about that, and there's nothing difficult about that. But in these kind of beliefs that I'm talking about, where people espouse something on the basis of no evidence, nothing that has ever compelled the belief, but something which has created this bubble of a belief in which they've then existed, we think of that as belief, but we've got no reason to. It's not like the automatic beliefs that, the bus is going to come along in 5 minutes because there's a schedule that it's going to keep. That sort of thing, that cushion is brown is, well, these are automatic beliefs. This is not something you have to be put in a bubble for. You've got those things automatically as a result of processes that you are not in control of. You see, you have expectations based on experience. Those things become automatic beliefs, and you're able to deal with them in an automatic way. You don't. If you say, do you believe that the bus will come along in 5 minutes? You'll say, yes, sure, I believe in it, and you'll give the reasons. It may not come out. Well, you may be wrong, but you at least believe it, and you believe it for reasons. So, in those cases, there is something about belief that makes some sense. But in the case of these beliefs that we're talking about, these fenced off beliefs that are ideological, that have no support in evidence, but only have the support of, let's use the 1984 for it, only have the support of groupthink. In that case, maybe we shouldn't call that belief at all. Maybe what you're doing, maybe it's not distinguishable to you, perhaps. You can't tell this, but maybe we shouldn't think of this as belief. Maybe we should distinguish whatever it is you're doing from believing. And if we can't say that it's really belief, now we can understand why anyone in the grip of this could be said to be in the grip of a philosophical neurosis. Because here is something that is a sham belief, an utterly illusory belief, a delusion that is masquerading for you as a belief that you have, and you can't tell that you don't really have that belief. What it seems to you is that you've got a very strong belief. If you're in the grip of all of this, yes, you believe X. You believe it. You'll die for it. You believe it with every inch of your life, with every breath that you take. And yet, you don't. It's all a lie. And that is what we need to be aware of in ourselves. How do we avoid it? One simple way. If someone challenges our belief, we have to give evidence for what we believe. We have to say, this is the evidence for why I believe it. And if we can't do that, if our impulse is to accuse the other person of being a this or a that, whatever it is, a fascist or whatever, a capitalist lickspittle, a doubter of this or that, whatever phrase we sling at them in order to stop them, we need to stop. We need not to do that. We need to stop and realize at that moment, if I can't give good reasons for what I believe that will be reasons that could convince them potentially, an objective person, someone outside, if I can't convince them of this, if I can't say something which will make what I believe make sense to them, not in my terms, but in terms that they can understand, that they can appreciate, evidence that they can go off and find for themselves. If I can't do that, then the problem is with me. Thank you.